Hey, y'all, welcome back to Coffee Over Apples. My name is Steph, and this is an independent review for The Color of Law. Listen, this book was so freaking good, okay? And I feel like it's super relevant right now. So if you're someone who is living in the current hellscape, or you might be thinking, hey, you know what? People should just move. If they're not happy here, just move. Go somewhere safe. Go to a state that has safety, or just leave the country or whatever. I need you to know that you need to pick up this book. I picked up this book before we crossed the starting line of the current hellscape. And I picked it up because I was just interested in learning more about redlining. I was interested in learning about how it is that the communities that I've always lived in, the communities that I grew up in, I grew up in impoverished communities. I'm a daughter of immigrants, and, just owning a home was kind of like the dream and the goal. And so when, after many years of sacrifice, my family was finally able to own a home, it was a big deal. And so I was really interested in learning about why it is that we have these dividing lines between neighborhoods in which it just felt like the ability to own a home felt unattainable. And I got to tell you, I gave this book 5 stars because I learned a lot. I learned a lot. And so if you're thinking to yourself, well, people should just move, it's not that easy. It's really not. What this book taught me was that there's over 100 to 150 years, which is a good chunk of our country's history, in which laws were made that in essence are unconstitutional, but in practice are not, that prevented people of color, and more specifically targeted Black families, to prevent them from building equity, to prevent them from homeownership. And the routes that people took to be able to do that are insane, like absolutely bonkers. Okay. So, one thing that I learned from this book is like, sure, when slavery was abolished, um, it's like, great, wonderful. But what we have to remember was that not everybody was on board with that, right? Not everyone was like, oh, all right, well, all right, there you go, Black people, go live your best life. Like, no, there were actively people working the system to be able to prevent people from exercising their newfound freedoms. Part of the long game that I learned was that the white bodies that were in power, that designated what businesses can go in what areas of towns and what housing was being built, what they did in order to not come off as racist, quote unquote, they would intentionally build certain neighborhoods away from white housing and zone them as industrial areas or factory areas. And so those areas would have toxic soil. Their regulations have not been good for how they dispose of certain products or how the area is taken care of. When those areas would be deemed not very habitable, Black families and families of color who could not find housing were forced to rent in those areas. And so now we have an association of, look at these families of color, they don't know how to take care of property because they're forced to only have access to homes or to rent in spaces that are not meeting sanitary regulations. And this rationale turned into politicians weaponizing that association to then say, we cannot let people of color into our neighborhoods because then they will turn our neighborhoods into what they did with their neighborhoods, even though that is not true. While at first a lot of them may not have said straight out, like, oh, we don't want Black people here, some of them did. They really did. The propaganda was real. The posters that were made at the time, just symbolizing the perfect nuclear white family. And there were certain laws in certain areas, depending on what state you were in, that would either frame the requirements for renters or the selling of property to people who could prove that they had proper income. Or if it's in a more outright racist place, they would say, we don't sell to Blacks, period. And if there was a white family who decided to stick their neck out and say, hey, we will sign these papers and then on the back end sell this property to a Black family because we don't think it's fair, those white people would be chased out of town. This letter 3 times, you know what that is, right? These people, they would show up and they would fearmonger the families that lived there, both the whites and the Blacks, if there were any white people helping them. The police would actually jump in and help. And it's just insane behavior. This happened up until the 1990s, guys. It didn't become illegal practice until the 1990s. And so if there's anyone who is thinking, oh, well, that was 25 years ago, we're fine, right? No, we're not fine. We're not fine because just because finally we got a majority in political power that has decided, hey, this is unfair treatment, this is unconstitutional, we cannot discriminate on housing based on color or ethnicity, that doesn't mean that everyone just started thinking that way. For example, let's talk about projects, right? Growing up, projects always had a negative connotation, and I think in a lot of places they still do, right? Negative connotation is in projects is something that is for people of color, poor people of color. You don't go by the projects, bad things go down in the projects. As someone who grew up in those kinds of places, it was really interesting to me to learn that projects were originally invented for white people. They were originally invented in specific places that were supposed to be accessible to industry, to the blue-collar working class. At the time that they were invented, the government would reject that they could be white-only spaces because companies were required to build for people of color. So what these contractors would do is, in order to get permission and permits in order to build these white-only projects, that they would also agree to build a Black-only projects or a POC-only projects. And so instead of integrating, they would build 2 separate projects in different areas. And then once the building was finished being constructed for the people of color, it was just abandoned. It was not maintained. The associations who were in charge of the building's maintenance would not spend any money or resources in order to maintain the infrastructure. It all went to the white housing. And so that also kind of fed into this idea that, oh, look, we give Black people and people of color something good and they ruined it. It's like, no, that's not what happened. At the same time, there were some areas, for example, one that I learned about was the Sojourner Truth Project in Detroit. Whites rioted when they learned that there was going to be a Black housing project that was built in the area. And so there were some unfortunate things that happened. And even though, once again, this letter, 3 times, people who support that showed up and hurt people who were trying to make sure that people of color got adequate housing, a majority of the people who were arrested on record were Black. Crazy behavior. Absolutely crazy behavior. So zoning and home inspections were invented to determine if certain areas could be listed as green or red. A green area had no Blacks in it. A red area did. That's literally why home inspections were invented. In the 40s and 60s, it was common for white neighborhoods to pool their money to own property that they had no intention of building on or renovating, just so people of color could not own that land or that property. And so there was no incentive for brokers to be transparent about policies when they were selling to people of color, because they would receive kickbacks for signing on buyers with subprime loans. These people's interest rates and things would just be astronomical. And because there was lack of funding in education systems in these towns where people are being forced to go to school due to segregation, due to the zoning laws, money from those towns gets siphoned into the schools. And if the town is not doing well, the school has less resources. So people were not getting the education that they needed in order to understand what is a reasonable mortgage or what is a reasonable loan. And that creates this generational disenfranchisement. And I don't even know that's a word, probably just made that up. The only thing that I did not agree with the author on this point that they made, and I will note that the author is a white scholar, is that there was a point where they said something along the lines of they don't believe that we should hold the government accountable for the actions of a few rogue cops. And I'm going to really beg to differ here. I highly disagree. We should hold the government accountable for the actions of our police officers. The United States, from what I understand, and editing stuff, go ahead and double check this. The United States has less hours in regards to training with their police force than quite a few other countries. Something that I think is lacking in our training academies is ethics. So, or extensive ethics, ethics around CRT and DEI, which we know are hot topics right now, but there's a reason why we need those things, especially if police officers are going to be patrolling in marginalized spaces. There's a reason that these spaces are marginalized, because look who enforces that marginalization. So I disagree with him that the government should not be responsible. I think they are highly responsible, but that's just my 2 cents on that. Other than that, I think that this book taught me so much. And this is one of those books that I think everybody needs to read. I think it needs to be required reading, but that's just my 2 cents. Anyway, if you want to get more content from me, I have all of my social media linked below, along with book clubs and everything. I post videos whenever I feel like it. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Mr. Wonka.